Olá a todos e todas que estamos acompanhando nessa conferência de encerramento da AMPU, Distrito Federal. É um prazer ter todos vocês aqui. Hoje a gente vai receber aqui o professor Harvey Kaye, que é um sociólogo, historiador norte-americano, autor de vários livros importantes e professor na Universidade de Wisconsin. Entre as suas obras mais importantes está Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, The British Marxist Historians e The Power of the Past, além de vários outros livros. Hoje ele vai nos dar o prazer aqui de conversar sobre diversos temas que vão de história até as relações internacionais, passando também por essas eleições de 2020. Presente aqui para conversar com o professor Harvey estão as colegas Ana Beatriz Cosme, Ana Carneiro, professor Marcelo Adolfi, Gino Pinori, Jonas Pegoraro, Yuri Franco, Daniel Gomes de Carvalho, Renata Mello, Matheus Torres e eu, Jonathan Portela, que vou conduzir aqui a conversa. Então, a partir de agora nós vamos conversar em inglês com o professor Harvey Kaye e vocês podem aí acionar as legendas. Professor Kaye, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you again. A few months ago, you gave an interview to Nota de Rodapé, the interlocution problems, and we had a lot of fun. Despite the tension that was due to the possible re-election of Donald Trump, I think now is a calmer time, right?
Well, it's funny you say that, because in certain ways it's even more anxiety ridden. There's even more anxiety, a little more nervousness, because what will happen if Donald Trump refuses to leave the White House? I mean, I think there's each day the likelihood of him trying to stage some kind of coup decreases, because each day one more Republican sort of leans into the truth. And the other thing is, there's a theory, maybe everyone will enjoy this. The theory goes that somewhere around Christmas, he will leave the White House, fly to his club and estate in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, and hold up there all the way, like, for the next few months, right? That way he'll never have actually said he's lost, but at the same time, his action in leaving Washington will indicate his deference, you might say. And then the other thing is whether or not he tries to pardon himself for all the corruption, okay, that he and his administration have practiced, or will he hand over to his vice president, Pence, Mike Pence, I guess it is, and in hopes that not hopes, knowing he might pardon him. I mean, there's lots of questions like that. But I can tell you, there are more smiles on the majority of American faces this week than there were 2 weeks ago. How's that?
Trump claims that your state, Wisconsin, needs to go through a vote recount process because of possible fraud. Professor, did you help defraud the elections and defeat God's chosen one to make America great again? If so, we thank you a lot.
Well, I will tell you that my grandfather, who lived in New York City, used to say that it was essential to vote early and to vote often. But I will not tell you that I practiced his advice. Okay.
All right. Fair enough, Professor.
But I also, if I could, I'd also like to point out that the numbers that concern me even more than any question of fraudulent votes is the fact that Wisconsin is really suffering the pandemic, and has for many weeks now, and that 245,000 Americans have died as a consequence of Donald Trump's inaction and lack of care about his fellow citizens.
That's not what I heard in Fox News, but okay. All right, no problem, Professor. So for the first question, I invite Professor Daniel, please.
Hello, Professor Harvey. I'm very happy that you agreed to talk with us. And whenever I talk to you or read your texts, I always learn a lot. And today I have two questions about the independence of the United States, which I thought from our last conversation about the history of the United States. The last time we talked, you commented on the radical aspects of America independence, which allow us to call independence as a genuine revolution. In fact, you told me something that I really liked. You said that Common Sense, the book that Thomas Paine published during independence, was a kind of mirror, because while many believed that Americans were taking back the freedoms of the past, Paine would have shown that they were doing something else. Indeed, books widely known as those by Eric Foner, Gary Nash, or Gordon Wood show the complexity of independence. My first question then is, if we consider that the independence of the United States did not abolish slavery, did not give women a vote, why could we still consider it a revolution? Although Paine was an abolitionist and a Democrat, we know that his United States project was not, at that time, the winner. Isaac Kremnick, in his text on the Federalists, recalls how the United States Constitution was a project of the supporters of the strong states, somewhat different from the project of the first Republicans, like James Otis. This is my first question. My second question
No, wait,
is
Daniel.
okay.
Wait, can we take each question so I don't?
Okay.
Okay. And but first of all, I want to say that I'm honored, I am excited, and with all due respect to Gino, I am nervous. Okay. So, but I think that's a great first question. First thing I want to say is, yes, I argue that Paine's Common Sense in many ways was a mirror. And for those who don't quite understand what I mean by that, when Thomas Paine arrived in America in late 1774 and then sort of gets out and about in Philadelphia in 1775, what he discovers is something which really had to appear to him already revolutionary. I mean, most students don't learn that in 1774 through 1775, Americans had already, in their own fashion, carried out a revolution. It was called a rebellion. Now, it was a revolution because they essentially threw out British authority and they organized committees to regulate and govern their towns and their cities. And which, by the way, would be an anarchist dream, really, without question, okay? The self-governance kind aspect. So when Paine, but it is the case that at no point, there's no point at which any of their leaders actually call for separation from Britain. It remains that of Britain recognizing that Americans too are British and they should have the rights that their cousins in England and Scotland have. And what that means is that no legislation without representation, which conservatives like to say no taxation without representation, but it really is no legislation without representation. So, and by the way, Edmund Burke, I'm sure you all know that name. Edmund Burke himself, in March of 1775, gave a speech to Parliament in which he basically tells his fellow parliamentarians, we must be very careful. If we push too hard against these Americans, they will realize what they have done. They have carried out a revolution and they've set up a government of their own. And by the way, what makes it even more interesting is that Burke himself said, it's not as if he worried about what happened in America and the whole system of colonialism. What really worried him was the fact that that revolution would set an example to the world. And the very things that those parliamentary figures held dear about the British order would literally be threatened because the British people themselves would realize, well, wait a minute, maybe it is the case that we can start the world all over again, as Thomas Paine said, okay? But for some reason, that too is a speech that tends to be forgotten. And of course, Burke wasn't speaking in a way to incite the Americans. Paine arrives, and I doubt very much if he might have, but I doubt if he had actually read Burke's speech, but it's possible. And what he sees is astounding to him, as I said. And so Common Sense is that call for revolution. Now, you bring up this is the point. It's a very good question. To what extent is it the revolution that Thomas Paine imagined? Okay, I mean, Thomas Paine himself, one of his first writings was a call for the abolition of slavery. Now, it is absolutely true that the abolition of slavery does not take place in the southern states, but the revolution does instigate the end of slavery in the northern states, more slowly, perhaps, than African Americans themselves would have liked, desired, I mean, hoped for, but it does take place. And I think you Brazilians can fully appreciate the difficulties of trying to carry out the end of slavery overnight. Leave it, okay? Then, but here's the other thing, and this is where Isaac Kramnik's work is important. You brought up my very dear friend, Isaac Kramnik, who passed away last year. Isaac and I, by the way, used to argue. We would argue. He was a good generation older than I am, but we argued. He called Paine a radical liberal. I called Paine a radical Democrat.
Yes.
Okay. And he was insistent on that, and he was wrong, just for the record. He was wrong. Now, but here's the thing. The one thing that Paine's revolution involved, which was truly revolutionary, okay, and I'll come back to the other elements, is that Paine repeatedly in Common Sense, I think we could count maybe 4 times in Common Sense, is adamant, is very serious about the separation of church and state. And in the 18th century, that is a radical idea, a revolutionary idea. And if you look at the Constitution, as Isaac Kramnik and I think his friend, maybe Lawrence Moore, I think is his co-author, wrote in a book on the Constitution, it is a godless Constitution. At no point is there a reference to God. 1, 2, the Bill of Rights, the very first element in the American Bill of Rights is the separation of church and state. It's not worded like that. Jefferson later gives the words to that. And the other thing to remember is, and this is really interesting, there are no religious tests for holding office. So that if you're going to run for office, you didn't have to be, a Congregationalist or well, decidedly they wouldn't have empowered Catholics if they really thought about it, or Jews. But the fact is there are no religious tests. So you think about it, that's an incredible transformation in itself, which also then empowers religious pluralism and even ultimately deism and atheism, if you might say. Okay, so that's that. The other thing is that one thing that comes out of Common Sense, because he does lay out a plan, he actually lays out the first vision of a constitution in Common Sense, is he makes it very clear that this constitution from the people, not from the government, it emanates from the people, will be democratic. He never uses the word democracy, but everyone knew that it was literally endowed with that democratic spirit that he himself possessed. And it's very clear, okay, that this is imperative, that this be constructed as democratically as possible. And he does refer, of course, to the idea of a Bill of Rights having to do with certain freedoms. Foremost among them, he says, is that freedom of conscience or freedom of worship. So in defense of the revolution, I would say, it was a promise that gets literally reiterated in the Declaration of Independence, which was authored by a slaveholder. So, and that promise is itself not simply idealism, but it is actually embedded from the beginning in an imperative and an impulse, if you understand what I mean. Yes. And so, did that sort of get at what you were asking, Daniel?
Yeah. And I remember John Adams speaking when he said, "We live in the world that ancients would have liked to have lived," and I totally agree that revolution is an opening, or as in French, an ouverture for all of that demands. And I have a second question.
Well, just know that, okay? I always tell my students that the greatest line, well, there's some great lines in Common Sense. The greatest line is, of course, the one that's added in the first appendix. We have it in our power to begin the world over again.
Yes.
That's got to be the most revolutionary line in human history, however untrue it may also be. In other words, there is no original creation or recreation. And yet what it means is that humanity creates the polity, the economy, and the society. And by the way, those are lines that effectively reappear in Marx, and even more remarkably, when Franklin Roosevelt runs for president in 1932, he makes it clear that economic laws are not made by nature, they're made by human beings. So, yes. Okay, sorry, had to say that.
No, yes, and then in agrarian justice, we have a great project of social insurance and
social
so on.
Democracy, right.
And my second question is strongly connected to the first, because in your recent book, Make America Radical Again, you state, quoting Max Lerner, the importance of rediscovering the past. And we know that in the United States, there is a national narrative which is present, for instance, in many films or books. According to this national narrative, the history of the United States would be conservative and led by heroes, all white and male. It seems to me that in your book, Make America Radical Again, you are saying that there is another history of the United States, a radical history. And it's important to know in order to defend at present a radical agenda. And I remember in your book, you tell about your rebellion against your teachers during your childhood. My second question then is, do you think the United States relationship with its past is changing today? If so, how?
Well, let me put it this way. We are in the middle in this country, and I think in the world clearly, but I will first refer to the United States. We're in the middle of a remarkable crisis, really a crisis and every crisis affords, as you said about revolution, the possibilities and opening. And if we think back over the last several months, and I do confess that you probably know more about what has been going on in the United States than I and my fellow Americans know about the daily progress or regress of Brazil because of the nature of the global media. But let me say this past summer, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was an extraordinary movement, first of all, because it was youthful and multiracial. I mean, it was extraordinary. It was, in one sense, as much as conservatives tried to portray it as subversive and a threat to all standards, it was extraordinary because it really was so diverse and so essentially peaceful. I mean, it was imagine million, or I don't even know how many actually turned out in cities across the country. And one of the aspects of that movement was a determination. Sometimes they took down the wrong statues, but nevertheless a determination to demand a different history, that a different history should be celebrated. Okay, that in the South, that the so-called heroes of the Confederacy, who were traitors, that those folks should be taken down from their pedestals. Okay, so, and I experimented. I tweeted one day, as long as all of those statues are coming down, let's put up statues of Thomas Paine. And it's interesting how many women said, no, let's start putting up more, radical women on those statues. So, there was that spirit. I mean, there was a sense that even if we can't start the world over again, we can start telling a history that might inspire progressive change. So I think that it's going to be, look, struggles don't occur overnight. They don't see victories overnight. But the younger generation is not unlike my generation of the 1960s, a really remarkable generation, and I think offers a lot of reason to hope. And even more than my generation, it seems to me that they are transcending the racial divide that even marked very seriously the struggles of the 1960s. Does that sort of get at what you were asking?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for the answers.
Okay.
All right, now I invite Ana Beatriz for the next question.
Okay, I'm looking up there. Okay.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So I'm Ana Beatriz, and I research about Mary Wollstonecraft, and she also responded to Burke when he said what he said about French Revolution, and it made me wonder if there were any human any
Okay.
human agreeing or disagreeing with Thomas Paine in independence in that context, because I don't know, like there is any human he agreed, he disagreed, he wrote about, I don't know, basically this.
Are you asking to what degree women involve themselves in the struggle that Paine envisioned? Or are you asking, is Paine a feminist?
No, the first one.
Okay. Yes, it's been okay. It is interesting that you ask. In Thomas Paine's Crisis Papers, he actually calls out women to join in the revolution. He praises, I'm forgetting the name right now, the example of a woman who manned the cannons in New Jersey. I'm forgetting her name, but it's very clear that he is himself eager to see women throw themselves into the struggle. Now, it's also the case that women did throw themselves into the struggle, both in the usual sense of attending to the army. Okay, and we should never, by the way, I mean, that in itself was a very arduous set of activities, but it's clear that women engaged it because women were tavern keepers. Okay, they were suppliers of the military. In fact, Gary Nash, in his book, I think, does a really great job of laying out the diversity of the forces that engaged the revolution, both, by the way, in favor of the struggle and also making demands on the struggle by lining up with the British, okay, on the question of the British told African-American slaves in Virginia, if you join our struggle, then at the end we'll give you, we'll give you freedom. And by the way, that they exaggerated and lied terribly, but that's besides the point. Yes, women did involve themselves, and Paine himself engaged them in his own writing that they should do so. And not surprisingly, in the course of Paine's own work, we can see strong suggestions of his feminism. Now, that feminism itself is a consequence of his own struggles and I believe, the loss of his wife in childbirth. I think it's rooted there. But there's no doubt about the very, very close friendship between Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine, and likely her further influence on his thinking. In fact, just the other day, a statue of Mary Wollstonecraft went up in England, which has created some controversy because it's an image of a very attractive nude woman, and so it was seen as controversial because of the nudity. But the stories that were presented in the press, which celebrated, made it very clear that Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine were very, very close. Okay, and so I do think that Mary Wollstonecraft influences Paine. I know that Thomas Paine significantly influenced her. It's also interesting, since you have read Mary Wollstonecraft, that her writings are not nearly as revolutionary as it's imagined. It's a determination. I mean, she basically asks, why would you want to keep women down? These are the very same women who will be raising your children. I mean, but she is clearly the first of the modern feminists, and I think she should be celebrated in those terms. And she had a real influence in the United States, especially, it's hard to say amongst laboring women, but decidedly amongst what we would think of generally as middle-class women. And a feminist movement emerges. I'm not a specialist on that. In the 1790s, I'm pretty sure, influenced in part by her. So, you know, yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up her name. I'd like to see statues of her too.
Not just don't start with nudity. Like, it's not her.
No, it definitely is not. Right. It definitely is not. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your answer, Professor.
Oh, thank you. Are you a professor or a graduate student, can I ask?
A grad student.
Very nice. What are you working on? Am I allowed to ask questions as well?
Oh, all right. I'm working on the text that she published to Respond Burke, and I want to know why it has like forgotten. We remember the text about the rights of women, but we forgot about the text of rights of men. And I think that the two of them, it's together speaks about how she saw society, not just one or the other.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And I hope you
Thank,
do very well in your work.
thank you.
Okay, now I invite your friend, Gino.
Okay, very good. Gino, you're in Brasilia. Is that the case?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, my question was kind of answered by your second answer to Daniel, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Politics is a constant and vast work. You wrote about democracy, ideology, Marxism, education, Thomas Paine, and, of course, the writing of history. In this year, almost all of those themes played with fundamental aspects of the crisis the world is, allegedly, getting through. In Take Hold of Our History, you associated the knowledge of the American past with a radicalization by the society argued necessary to start solving structural problems in USA. Knowing the past of the American Revolution, deemed radical enough to, I quote, begin the world over again, would be necessary to it because the narratives make action possible by making it meaningful. In this deeply divided society, after the election the world just watched, and that is facing the worst sanitary pandemic in a decade, do you still believe that a radical study of the national past in such polarized times is the way to a better society?
That's a great question. A really great question. And I'm going to tell you first my answer with one word, yes. Okay? And I'll tell you why. And I'm going to explain it both in sort of historiographical or theoretical terms, and then I'm going to give you a prime example of why I think radical or progressive action can actually lead us to transcend this divide. Not entirely, that would be utopian, but why it would be essential. So it really is the case, as I have little doubt that Americans do carry with them a certain kind of memory of what America is supposed to be about. And the way the divide has come about, this division, some people call it a rural-urban divide. It's clearly a divide that involves a predominantly affluent and white part of America, anxious, concerned about the diversification of America. And okay, but it's also the case that many of the folks who have rallied to Donald Trump have themselves been from the white working class and not simply affluent sections of America. Well, things don't just happen. You know, there's that expression, if you'll excuse my language in English, shit happens. Okay, but things don't just happen. I mean, politics matters. And for 45 years, there has been a class war in America, and a class war that has been pursued by the corporate elite and by Republicans. And when I say Republicans, I mean conservatives. But what has really made it so tragic is how many members of the Democratic elite had turned to what we call neoliberalism. okay, had literally, and to be more precise about it, to leave that, the question of what neoliberalism is out, is they turned their back on the working class, the organized working class, in fact. I mean, the labor movement in America in the 1950s and even up until the 1970s went from one of every 3 workers was in a union to say 1 of every 4 workers was in a union. But even though the numbers were declining, there was real life in the labor movement, as indicated by the organization of public employees, municipal employees, state employees, school teachers. I mean, it was really expanding labor unionism among the white collar classes, okay? Now, in the early 70s, to make it clear, there really was a declaration of war against the working people generally, especially labor unions. And what we've seen for these last 45 years is not only a class war on labor and working people, it also involved, in order to make sure that labor remained disunited, a war on the rights of people of color, and also a war on the rights of women and the capacity to control their own bodies. Okay, so what in the course of all of that, the Democrats not only turned their back on those forces that had placed them regularly into power to pursue progressive ideals and legislation, also turned their back on the American story. When I was growing up, it was a very regular thing for Democrats to remind Americans of Thomas Jefferson, of more especially Franklin Roosevelt, the most progressive president in the 20th century in the United States. But somewhere in the 1970s, the Democrats turned their back on the story of the Democratic Party and the story of how America transcended its divisions in the past. But the Republicans grabbed hold of history and hijacked it. I mean, Ronald Reagan was absolutely brilliant. He used Franklin Roosevelt as his model, oddly enough. Franklin Roosevelt in the United States, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. But Franklin Roosevelt was also the history teacher in chief of the United States. He never gave a speech that was not imbued with a sense of American history. And what's amazing is he never hesitated to actually point a finger at the political and economic elites if they were obstructing American progress. He actually reminded Americans in 1936 of the revolution. And he said, in the revolution, we fought the political royalists. And he said, in 1936, we are going to fight the economic royalists. In fact, let me make it clear. He actually said, those economic royalists complain that we want to overthrow American institutions. And then he said, no, we want to overthrow their power. And that's what really frightens them. So where were the Democrats to try to remind Americans of how it was that we were able to beat the Depression and empower ourselves to be able to fight fascism in World War II? When kids are taught about Abraham Lincoln for all too many times, they'll talk about Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. He signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And what they often also fail to consider is the degree to which Lincoln himself was waiting upon and dependent upon African-American slaves running as quickly as they could in vast numbers to the Northern Army's lines to enlist or at least give their labors to that struggle. In other words, what I'm getting at is this: the Democrat, and by the way, and what I meant to say on that is Franklin Roosevelt in 1931, to show you how important he thought history was, said, the Republicans have essentially abandoned Lincoln. They don't want to talk about Lincoln. I think we should make Lincoln one of our own. And in fact, if you look at Franklin Roosevelt's 12 years of his presidency, during the 1930s, he over and over again is turning Thomas Jefferson into this great hero of democracy, okay, which is not completely untrue, but he goes well beyond the facts, you might say. And then as the war approaches, he grabs hold of Abraham Lincoln, and in essence, he uses Jefferson and Lincoln to validate and to empower himself and to encourage Americans, okay? Now, Ronald Reagan, he was the great hijacker of history, and basically he went literally takes American history and turns it inside out and upside down. His acceptance speech for the Republican nomination. You'll excuse me if I go on about this, but figure I've got a new audience to teach history. Here I'm going. So what Reagan did in his acceptance speech, because he had once upon a time been a Roosevelt Democrat, at the convention in 1980, he quotes 3 figures from American history to empower what comes to be called the Reagan Revolution. He quotes Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And I can tell you, conservative intellectuals, conservative columnists in newspapers were outraged. The Americans watching loved it. They loved hearing Paine and Lincoln and Roosevelt. But George Will, the leading conservative columnist in the Washington Post and Newsweek magazine, all that, he was outraged, said, wait a minute, a conservative president should not be quoting Thomas Paine. He should be quoting, guess who? Edmund Burke, right? So, okay. So what I'm thinking is this. The Democrats literally abandoned not only working people, the working class, they also abandoned the story of Americans' struggle and progress, which was not always one-dimensional. I mean, not at all, okay? I mean, after the Civil War and Reconstruction in the 19th century, there's a period known as down south, the Bourbon regimes take over and literally disenfranchise African Americans and poor whites. And they run one-party states in the southern part of the United States. So what I'm thinking is, imagine if the Democrats got smacked around a little bit and started remembering some history, okay? Imagine if Bernie Sanders had actually made more of American history. If Joe Biden started remembering his history and started talking to Americans about it, that's first. But then take the lesson from history, and here's the lesson. In the 1930s, the divisions among Americans were far greater, perhaps, than they were today in many ways. Racial, ethnic, religious differences mattered tremendously in the 1930s. Protestants despised Catholics and Jews and so on and so forth. But what Roosevelt did is he created massive public works projects in order to provide work and incomes to people and literally transform the American landscape, which brought together in the Civilian Conservation Corps 2 million young Americans of diverse backgrounds. And what they discovered is that they were Americans, that they weren't simply Italians or Jews or Irish or whatever else. And how do we know this? Because they wrote letters in vast numbers to the White House and actually spoke of how they came to see themselves as Americans, in addition to the fact they, for the first time, had adequate medical attention, they were learning skills, and so on and so forth. Similarly, at the level of the Work Progress Administration, which was for more adult men and women, but especially men. So my thinking is, if people would pay attention to the American story, not only for the sake of re-engaging the American imagination, they would also take the lesson of pursuing a great national rebuilding project and bring together diverse Americans from all around the country. Look, young Americans have already shown what they want to do. They were out in the streets for Black Lives Matter, and they were out in the streets in the full, if you like, mosaic of American. I mean, it was just absolutely gorgeous. It brought tears to my eyes, okay? So, you know, I think it's possible. If I didn't think it was possible, I'd stop teaching history.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Anna, it's up to you.
Oh, hi, Professor.
Look,
It
where am I
is such
looking?
an honor.
Okay.
Right here. Can you see me?
I want you big. How can I make you? Oh, Anna, with and last. How do you pronounce your last name?
Laranjera or Laranjada.
Right.
First of all, it's such an honor to be talking to you today.
The honor is mine, believe me. The honor is mine.
I'm a huge Michael Brooks fan as well, so talking to someone interviewed is
we miss
so
Michael.
I do, yeah, we all do. So my question ties in nicely with Juno's question, which is about the Green New Deal that's being proposed by the more radical side of the Democrats. and it's more related to the energetic transition that's being proposed. So the same as the New Deal promoted, the same way the New Deal promoted an energy transition from coal to oil, the Green New Deal proposes a transition from oil to renewables. And I was wondering if this legislation has the same potential to bring about change and remind Americans of their radical history. And I know professors hate when we ask them to make predictions about the future. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I'm wondering what your perspective on the Green New Deal is and the potential that it has to bring about this radical change that you suggest is so American.
That's a great question. It's so great. It's almost as if you were reading my mind of the last few months, okay? And I'll just start off by saying we'll talk in honor of Michael. And by the way, when you said you were a big fan of Michael's, my first thought was, and I have to tell you that no one on the left was more determined to keep the Lula story in our minds than Michael. Okay, and that will go down as one of his great efforts. Okay, so the Green New Deal is absolutely standing on the shoulders intellectually and politically of the New Deal of the 1930s. Let me start there, okay, to give you the sense of why I think it's possible and of course imperative. So part of the New Deal of the 1930s, and I mentioned it a bit before, was a transformation of the American landscape. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and other efforts there was a massive program of restoration of the environment. There was so for example, even here in Wisconsin, which is known as the dairy state, in the southwestern part of the state, which is much hillier than the rest of the state, there was tremendous soil erosion. Farmers had cultivated hillsides. I can't call them mountainsides, but they're sizable hills, and actually did a poor job of maintaining the soil. Okay, in the plain states, people always imagine the plain states was rich for cultivation, but actually the soil is very thin, or was very thin in the plain states. And after decades of cultivation, we ended up in the 1930s with what came to be known as the Dust Bowl, where the top layer of the American plain states was practically lifted up and sent to fall into the cities of Chicago and New York and Pittsburgh. I mean, it was a horrific kind of thing. And it involved a mass migration of folks from Oklahoma in particular, but from surrounding states out to California. So Franklin Roosevelt, who's actually always was first and foremost interested in agriculture, he had a remarkable team of folks who were going to address this. And they began massive projects of tree plantings in the plain states and elsewhere. The idea was that they were fully aware of the imperative that the New Deal should not only be to literally fight the Depression, lift up Americans, empower workers, address poverty, but also address the impoverishment of the American environment. And one of the reasons, of course, that it's called a Green New Deal is that if you imagine the massive kind of mobilization of resources that could go into the pursuit of the Green New Deal, and the energies that it would take. When I was talking a little while ago about a massive public works project, and I should have said, I meant in my head the Green New Deal, okay? So I do believe it's possible. And I'm going to tell you something else, which people on the left don't want to say. Look, the United States remains the most powerful nation on earth. It still is the place that people will look to for better or worse. And if we take up a Green New Deal, that will be a signal that we will not only go back into the Paris Accord, which in itself is a moderate kind of enterprise, but we would literally perhaps empower other peoples to pursue similar kinds of activities. And I don't say that chauvinistically. I say that because as a realist, it is imperative that America pursue the Green New Deal for my grandson's needs and for generations to come. It will both unite the nation and afford a future for the nation. Sorry, is that your answer that you're looking for?
Yes. So just to clarify, you also see the Green New Deal as an opportunity for the states, for the U.S. to emerge as a climate leadership in face of the
I really do.
China and everything else.
I think I don't want a climate. I'm not going to say I want it to be a climate imperialism, but Thomas Paine believed that America could set an example to the world, and I still believe that's possible.
Yeah, I agree, and I hope we were both right in believing that. Thank you very much for your answer.
No, thank you. And by the way, my hopes are that Brazil could lead the way in South America.
Yes. Yes, I hope so too, someday.
And make me learn Portuguese.
Oh, yes, that'll be my pleasure.
All right. Marcelo, please.
Hi, Professor. Very pleased. Thank you very much. I will try to explore your Marxist point of view or your Marxist conception of history. And I think that when we observe today or in the last decades, the USA facing military setbacks, financial problems, social upheaval, and electoral crisis, this necessarily takes us back to the 1960s and 1970s, when the United States faced similar problems.
Right.
The United States going through the same long-term structural crisis, which today is reaching maybe an acute level.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh, absolutely. But I was listening to everything you said, but I was also admiring the books behind you. My office at the university, which I have only been able to get to 2 or 3 times in this pandemic, is like that. Okay. So I was jealous of what I saw behind you. Okay. Look, yeah, I think the crisis today is worse than the crisis of the 60s, 70s. And I think the crisis is worse because in the 1960s and into the 70s, there still remained a strong and to some extent dynamic labor movement. And I remember reading maybe 20 years ago an interesting sort of global comparative study trying to address the question in terms of social classes in historical formation and conflict. Where does democracy emanate from? I mean, as I think you all know. If you don't, I'll let you know now. Jonathan and Daniel know. I trained in Latin American studies. My PhD actually is in Latin American studies. And one of the things that were startling to me was the repetition over and over again that in Latin America, as in the United States, the democratic class is the middle class. Okay, the middle class. And yet history tells us quite a different story, as I don't have to persuade you, I'm sure, that it's these struggles from below in their pursuit of, freedom, equality, and democracy that make democracy. I mean, it's those struggles that do that. So my fear now is that the powers, the corporate powers and others, who, by the way, have a far more global perspective than national perspective, in fact, that we've been so disempowered that our solidarities have been smashed. Is that clear when I say solidarities have been smashed? Okay. So that once upon, as I was saying before, when I was a child in the 1950s into the 1960s, 1 of every 3 workers was in a labor union. When a union called for, if the steel workers went out on strike or the oil workers, it involved not just thousands, but tens of thousands of people. And so in the 1970s, when they declared war on working people, they busted, they smashed, they broke up labor unions and then literally walked off with the profits. So my concern now is, how do we reinvigorate working class movement, labor movement? And there's even hope there. There's hope, okay? So in the last few years, the United States has seen remarkable energy from the bottom up. And in fact, that's one of the reasons, perhaps, that Donald Trump could not run as a traditional Republican. He had to run as something of you know that term, right-wing populism. You guys have suffered it too, okay? So, you know, Trump targeted as his antagonists the elite, you know, the bankers and others. What we saw, however, during these years was one movement was the Fight for 15, a struggle to raise the minimum wage to $15, which, by the way, should probably be in this country Fight for $20 right now. We saw movements at regional levels, such as in North Carolina. It was called the Moral Monday Movement, which was an interracial movement carried out mostly by working and middle-class folks. And that has given rise to a renewed poor people's movement in the United States. There were teachers' strikes. Chicago saw revitalization of the labor movement of teachers there and a teacher strike, which set an example. Oh, and I should have made very clear, my own state of Wisconsin, when Scott Walker, the very right-wing Republican governor, and the Republicans took power, the first thing they did is took back our right as public employees to organize and bargain collectively. And by the way, this was the first state in the United States that recognized the right of public workers unions, and then they broke our backs. And then 2 years later, they created what's called a right to work state, okay? Literally disempowering working people, terrible tragedy. But we saw teacher strikes then in states where teachers either didn't even have the right to bargain collectively and for sure did not have the right to go out on strike, West Virginia and places like that. So what I'm getting at is that there is this kind of resurgence. And also, I'll tell you, you may not know, I'm losing track of time, was just a year ago or 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, when Donald Trump closed the government. I mean, can you imagine a president of the United States closed the government? It was the president of the Airline Flight Attendants Union, who happened, I will tell you, to be open about it, she's a friend of mine, Sarah Nelson. She stepped forth at the head of her union and said, if the government is going to stay shut down, we're going to walk out. And she called for a general strike in the United States, and decidedly a strike in the airline industry. And that literally flipped the switch, and Donald Trump reopened the government. And Sarah Nelson remains the most significant voice in labor today, may even become the president of the American Federation of Labor. So what I'm saying is, while the situation is it's tragic, the smashing of the solidarities, I think we can see real possibilities. And even though Joe Biden is no leftist, he's no social democrat, he's actually historically a neoliberal, he has made it clear that he is committed to reviving the strength of labor. And if he doesn't do it, then we'll have to go on strike against him, I suppose. I mean, that's just an observation.
We hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now I invite Yuri for the next question.
Good morning, Harvey. It's an honor to talk with you. My name is Yuri Soares, and I am studying the São Paulo Forum in the master's degree at UNB. I don't know if you have heard of the Forum, which is an organization founded in the 1990s that brings together left-wing parties from Latin America. Far right says that Forum is a spectre of communism out in Latin America that tries to recreate CCCP in Latin America. And I say this because in my research, I became interested in the reasons why the United States left don't have a tradition of forming strong ties of international solidarity. I like the left parties in so many other countries. I saw many reports of the international politics of FLI-CIO, which is a great partner of CUT here in Brazil, but not of the Democratic Party itself. We recently saw the creation of the Progressive International, which still seems to me to be taken much more seriously by Latin America and Europeans than by the US left. To what do you owe this reticence, this certain isolationism? Because in the past, in the 20s, we had the CP-USA participation in Communism International, But after that, we don't see many leftists of the United States forming ties with other countries in the world. Why?
That's a really good question. And I can tell you, when I saw the list of possible subjects, this was the question that worried me the most. Okay. This was the question I almost told Daniel, can we not answer that question? Because it is actually a haunting question. Now, let me just start off with a side comment. Just the other day, I was reminded when I lived in Mexico in the 1970s a few times. I was living with a Mexican family, and the father was a doctor. He was a Peruvian doctor, and he had come to Mexico essentially years before, somewhat in exile. He had been a member of something you may not be fond of, but I'm sure it should resonate with you, the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana, APRA, which in fact envisioned the creation of an alliance of progressive Latin American parties. Most and foremost, they were hoping to create a more democratic Peru. And I will confess to you, I don't even know about the Progressive International. That's how ignorant I am about these kinds of things right now. But to answer your question historically, various thoughts occurred to me when I imagined this question being answered. And one of them is that there's a strange process which is a little bit different in the story of Brazil and Argentina, but a very strange process that occurs in American immigration. American immigrants during the 1920s, and keep in mind, we essentially closed the door on immigration in 1924 until 1965. But one of the things that took place is that many of these people who immigrated from Southeastern Europe, from Southern Europe, Italians and Slavs and East European Jews and others, they actually did get very active as progressives. I mean, these were the folks who joined the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party was never as large in the United States as it was portrayed to be. It was only 100,000 at its maximum strength in the 1930s. But they joined labor unions, and they turned those labor unions into progressive forces. However, there was such an emphasis on what was called Americanization, becoming American. And it's even in the 1930s, what happened was that those diverse immigrant groups, they all sought to lay claim to Americanism instead of having it imposed upon them. And I can't help but imagine that literally sort of made them less interested in overseas affairs, period. And also World War I was a huge disappointment to American working people. The assumption was that this was going to make the world safe for democracy. And not only did it not make the world safe for democracy, it didn't make the United States safe for democracy, because what ends up happening in the United States is the closing of the door to immigration, the strengthening of segregation in the South. So I think it has partly to do with this idea of Americanism. That's one thing. And then on top of that is the Cold War. I mean, it really was, in the late 1940s through the 1950s, there really, really was suppression of left politics in this country. And in fact, the communists were obviously the foremost, but the Communist Party was so small that in fact everyone really knew everyone who was critical knew what was at stake. They weren't going after the Communist Party. They were going after socialists and progressives and radicals. They were going after the folks who had made the New Deal happen. Now, so it doesn't answer your question, but I think between the sort of emphasis on Americanism and then the Cold War, I think there is this sort of instinct for isolationism. But I also will tell you that people on the left themselves, I think, are more aware and moving in a more globalist or internationalist direction. I thought, in fact, was it Anna? I thought you were going to ask me about this question when you mentioned Michael Brooks, because Michael was look, I'm 71 years old, but Michael's generation, 20s and 30s, these folks are very much aware of what's going on elsewhere. I'm not sure to what extent they're organized enough to create alliances, but I'll give you an example. This past couple of weeks, the young left has celebrated developments in Bolivia. And so I can tell you that for years, I never heard that kind of talk amongst the left. So I apologize that I can't give you an adequate answer. I can tell you that obviously the more connected, the more allied we are, the better off we're all going to be, if only for the fact to call efforts to suppress democracy. I mean, I use the example of Brazil these last several years, and now, of course, here in the United States, a similar kind of development.
Great. Thank you. Just one more question.
Okay.
We have here in Brazil a journalist that you should know who is a very critical of the possibility of disputing the direction of a Biden government. His name is Glenn Greenwald.
Sure.
He claims that in international relations, democratic governments tend to act as badly as Republicans. For example, he discovered that during the Obama administration, the NSA spied on Dilma and her entire government, as well as supporting Operation Lava Jato to carry out the 2006 coup. I have been talking to unionists linked to DSA, and they believe that only popular participation will be able to change that. What do you think we Brazilians and Latin Americans can wait from the Biden government in international relations?
You know, that right now we're all looking. Look, until I see the cabinet that gets announced, I don't think I can predict the future. As Anna said, professors, don't want to predict the future. I do know. Look, I've been a Bernie Sanders supporter since the 1980s when he first entered politics. And my hope and aspiration was that we would see a Bernie Sanders presidency. Maybe I was fantasizing too much. But it is the case that that possibility presented itself, and it would not only have changed American political life, public life significantly, I think it would have clearly changed America's relations with the world. The last few years with Trump is clearly at its worst. At its worst. I mean, if you look, Turkey, Brazil, the Philippines, wherever Donald Trump saw an authoritarian right-wing, I was going to use four-letter words. I won't do that right now. Whenever he saw them, he embraced them. He basically got into bed with them. Okay. Bernie Sanders would have been utterly different. Joe Biden is by no means a radical and progressive on international affairs. However, there is reason to believe, and look, people keep asking me, how can we push Biden a bit further to the left?
That's the question.
And I can tell you that I have a different view than many on the left who are outspoken. There's a desire to declare war on the Biden administration before it gets started. I don't think that's the smart way to go at all. I think the smart way to go is to actually believe that if Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some other senators who are progressive, if AOC and what's known as the Squad, which will grow in numbers in January, that if these folks are serious, and obviously they are, then our task is to literally mobilize to empower them to advance a progressive agenda both domestically and internationally in Congress, so that to declare war on Biden will literally just turn him all the more towards the Republicans that he thinks he can work with. And I think the trick is to give our energies to pushing our representatives who are progressive in Congress to pull Biden, that they should be outspoken and proclaim now their agenda and their eagerness to work with Joe Biden in pursuing it. And I will tell you, if it helps at all, just the other night, I'm going to actually show you, Bernie sent out an email to his followers, okay? And he lays out in here the agenda that he's going to pursue in the US Senate. Now, he can't do it by himself, but there are others who can join with him. So let me give you an example. Elizabeth Warren is a progressive, and her basic politics has to do with regulating corporations. Bernie Sanders is labor and social change. A man named Markey from Massachusetts is the co-author with AOC of the idea of the Green New Deal. He's in the US Senate and he just won re-election. Merkley from Oregon, who I believe is an independent, but caucuses with the Democrats, as does Bernie, he is already on record aligning himself with those kinds of forces. There's 4 senators, and then there's another man, Sherrod Brown. There's a possibility to pursue change from that angle, as well as with the enlarged squad. So I don't want the left to be seen as proving what the conservatives in the Democratic Party say. That is, the left is costing us victories. I want the left to act like leaders, okay, before we have to act like opposition. That's my thinking right now, for what it's worth.
Well, thank you so much, Harvey. Again, it was an honor to talk with you. I hope we can talk again in the future. And
let's hope the pandemic ends and I can finally get to I've never been in Brazil.
Yes, we are welcome here in Brasilia.
Thank you.
And I pass to another one to talk now.
Okay.
Professor Harvey, so far so good.
Is it your turn, Jonathan, or are you passing to someone else?
No. I'm asking. So far so good.
Oh yeah, I love you guys.
Don't say things like that. We are shy. We are shy now, Professor. If you say that you love us. When will you be with us in person to talk and most importantly drink together?
When will that happen?
Yeah, when you come to Brazil.
Okay, so
we have to schedule that.
When was it that we spoke? When did we speak last, you and I?
I think it was September, Danny.
I don't know if I told you what I have done. I actually retired from the university.
You were the last time you talked, you were about to retire.
Yeah, I didn't want to. I love teaching. I just can't imagine not teaching. But I didn't want to teach online. I like this. This is fun. Conversations are great. But the idea of standing before my computer with 50 students, some of whom won't even show me their faces, okay, and may not even really be in the room, I thought that's not my idea of teaching at all.
So that's a good excuse for you to come to Brazil and become a professor here.
Hey, that's exciting. That's an exciting possibility.
You can learn Portuguese in 2 weeks. It's a very easy language.
Well, I know, as I said, I know Spanish. I hope so. And my wife knows Portuguese. She'll stop talking to me in English. So, so the plan was, if I ever did retire, which I had not ever intended to do, that we would get to. There were 2 countries that were high on our list to visit, and one is Portugal. I can tell you that I've been to Spain once, in the northwestern part of Spain. I didn't get into Portugal. My wife and daughter did. My wife lived in Portugal and in Spain a number of times. Her degrees are in Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Birmingham. My wife is originally British. And, you know, the assumption was we'd get to Brazil, in Brazil and Portugal. And just for what it's worth, can I just ask a very silly question?
There are no silly questions here.
Well, no, this is silly. I love Portuguese food. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I've eaten in many, and I've also eaten in many Brazilian restaurants. I love it. But do you have sardines is that a dish in Brazil as it is in Portugal? Grilled sardines.
No. Real sardines, no.
No, okay. That was it's a North Atlantic thing, I suppose.
Sorry for making my country disappoint you.
I can't tell you how I love grilled sardines, just so you know.
All right. We can promise we try to cook.
Okay.
Some. All right. Okay. So I invite Renata for the next question.
Renata, right?
Yes.
I love that name, just so you know. For decades, I've loved that name.
Thank you. It's really nice to have you here. And regard the current, my English is very bad, okay?
Better than my Portuguese.
Okay. Regarding the current post-election scenario, what's your perspective on policies aimed at Black and the Latin population in the USA? And what you are reading about the role of the group in the Joe Biden victory?
Sorry, the last couple of words I did. What victory?
Yes. What's your position in the Black people in USA and Latin America?
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, in terms of policies ahead, you know, this is, first of all, there are those of us on the left, who, black and white, who really do believe that we need to understand that the best way, perhaps, to transcend, if you like, the racial injustice and racial divide is not only to guarantee equal rights, and not only, by the way, I'll just give you one example and then I'll move on to the question. I'm convinced regularly that the terms that we use for our politics are pushed upon us by the media and conservatives. And I'm going to tell you that I do not like the term that you may have heard of, defund the police. That's a killer term. It will not garner support in the vast majority of communities. Okay?
Okay.
What it should have been, and it's a very hard thing to control the rhetoric, is demilitarize the police. There has, without question, been a militarization of police over these last few decades, both in terms of ideology and in terms of the equipment that they're given, okay, to control people. Heavy equipment. So what I would say is that, first of all, we really need to do a better job of controlling the rhetoric and in terms of the struggle. And the reason I say that is conservatives in the Democratic Party and conservatives in the Republican Party, they have said that the left, the political left, cost the Biden campaign votes, which is not true. It is absolutely not true. For a start, if we believe that the polls tell us anything, Black and Latinas were essential to the victory of Joe Biden. That's part of it. But here's the other thing. When they spoke of how the left damaged the campaign, they did this. They said, defund the police and Medicare for all were what damaged the campaign because the left was pushing that. Well, imagine if people see these as coupled, as connected, it doesn't help the cause of Medicare for all, of universal health care, nor does it necessarily help the cause of demilitarizing the police. So that was difficult. But now let me get to the better question. There was a Black labor and civil rights leader in the 20th century, A. Philip Randolph, who was one of my heroes. A. Philip Randolph, who came out of the South and moved north, became the head of, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is basically the African-American workers on the trains that traveled the country, especially the trains that had overnight sleeping accommodations, but also restaurants and all of that. And A. Philip Randolph in 1926 gave a very interesting speech. It was the 150th anniversary of American independence. And in this speech, which he gave, it was like an audience of I believe, tens of thousands, which was probably a northern audience, a mixed audience. And he said, You know, he said, the historians don't necessarily tell us, but we know that African Americans brought democracy to the South for the first time during Reconstruction. Here, and he says in 1926, maybe we can bring economic democracy to America in the 20th century. Now, what he didn't say, he didn't fail at any time to organize and mobilize African American workers. I mean, that was his mission. But he really did see that the struggle of African American workers was the struggle not only for African American workers, it was the struggle for Americans. Believe me, stick with me. I'm getting to this, okay?
Okay.
So, A. Philip Randolph is the man who launched what was known as the March on Washington movement in 1941, which compelled FDR to sign orders to desegregate the defense industries before the war. And after the war, it was that same A. Philip Randolph who pushed Harry Truman to desegregate the American military. In 1960s, in the midst of the civil rights struggles, A. Philip Randolph and a man, and also Walter Reuther, who was the head of the United Auto Workers, who wrote the checks to make it possible, they organized the March on Washington movement for jobs and freedom, the great March on Washington that's famous for Martin Luther King's speech. 250,000, 250,000 Americans descended upon Washington and filled the National Mall. Now, it was jobs and freedom, okay? A. Philip Randolph then launched the idea of a freedom budget in 1965 and 66, a massive project that would expand Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty. And what he does, Randolph, is he subtitles it To Achieve Freedom from Want. Randolph was quoting Franklin Roosevelt. You see the historical dimension here. And what Randolph offers is a massive program to end poverty in America by way of massive public works projects that will provide jobs for every American who wants it, which is what FDR called for in an Economic Bill of Rights. 150 academic leaders, labor leaders, foundation leaders signed on. It seemed that there was a moment that this could happen. And by the way, Lyndon Johnson staged a conference in Washington. The name of the conference I've forgotten right now. But at that conference, the idea was to honor A. Philip Randolph. So that it's crucial. The problem is, or the tragedy was, is that Lyndon Johnson placed more emphasis on the war in Vietnam than he did in pursuing any kind of Great Society war on poverty. But talk about tragedy, that's a tragic moment. Now, let me bring it into the present. I believe that too often the question of African American and Latin American standing in America leaves the class question behind, and it has for too long. So in addition to any kind of demilitarizing of the police, recognition of transformation of the justice order, there needs to be a rejuvenation of the question of class and the degree to which the question of class for African Americans is the same question as it is for white Americans, white working people. So to my mind, Black Lives Matter, I was doing a lot of shows, podcasts and radio during that time, and I still do. And every time people were talking about Black Lives Matter, I kept saying, what we need is a new A. Philip Randolph to articulate the struggle in the street into not only a struggle for justice, but also a struggle for, if you like, social transformation, economic transformation that would provide an economic Bill of Rights. And I thought back to A. Philip Randolph in 1926. Maybe the African-American movement can bring economic democracy to America. Anyhow, that's the best I can tell you, okay?
Okay. One question, please, Jonathan or Daniel. Uma dúvida, I speak in Portuguese, okay?
Okay.
Translate Jonathan or Daniel.
Okay.
Uma curiosidade, meninos, eu gostaria que vocês perguntassem, por gentileza, qual é o olhar dele sobre a história de Assata Shakur, uma American African que vive em Cuba por conta de perseguições políticas. E até os dias atuais ela é considerada como uma de alta periculosidade nos Estados Unidos.
Na lista da CIA.
Yes. Eu gostaria de saber, please, Harvey, Kate.
So, Professor Harvey,
sobre o olhar dele sobre essa situação até os dias atuais, por favor.
So she wants to know how do you see, in a historical perspective, the figure of Assata Shakur? Do you know who is she?
I confess I do not.
Ele não a conhece.
Panteras Negras.
From the Black Panthers.
Oh, wait. Hold on. So who are we talking about?
So she's asking you to talk about Assata Shakur. She was a member of the Black Panther. She's alive.
I have to plead ignorance. That's just not. I don't know.
Okay.
But
it's a great figure.
You have to send me an email so I can find out more.
Okay.
Okay.
So I invite myself for the next question. So, Professor Harvey, great to talk to you again. Despite living in Brazil for many years, practically all my life, I am an American citizen, and I have been voting in American elections since 2008.
You have been voting? You
have? I have been voting, yeah.
What state do you vote in?
Florida, unfortunately. Yeah. Don't judge me, Professor. I tried.
No.
I tried.
No, I can tell you that with all the talk of, Trump claiming a stolen election, I still wonder to what extent somebody stole the election in Florida again.
Yeah. So that makes me have a special interest in the politics of this country. I will not resist a small and respectful provocation. I think you even touched on this issue, but I will be more incisive. It is possible to see an advance of progressivism in the United States. This year, DSA women were elected as Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, as well as Sarah McBride, the first transgender woman to be elected to the Senate House. The vote of the Black population was also very important, especially in states like Arizona and Georgia, especially with the activism of people like Stacey Abrams. This progressivism is not necessarily reflected in the figure of Biden and Harris. It is not credible that...
Okay, Jonathan, just one thing, okay?
All right.
Just one thing. I have been, whenever I say what you just said, I am regularly challenged because apparently, I know this is going to be, I have no great hopes on this, but Harris in the Senate actually has a very progressive voting record.
But not as an attorney, right?
No, not. And there are other things we could say. But I just wanted everyone to realize that, okay? I'm not defending her. I just wanted it on the table.
No, I understand that, Professor. It's just an honest question, all right? And I want to talk about Kamala Harris, actually. She was, because, she had many progressive actors in the Senate, but she was one of the most hellish attorneys for the Black people of California in recent decades. For years, she has remained silent about the manipulations in laboratories that have yielded multiple drug convictions, arrested thousands of Black people for marijuana possession, signed a law that guaranteed life sentences for repeat offenders, and prevented implementation of basic rights to transgender inmates. And she buried a lot of investigations on several policemen with a history of brutal violence. My question is, to what extent does DSA progressivism conflict with the old guard of the Democratic Party? And I'm not talking about Sanders. I like Sanders.
I think you've answered your own question, Jonathan.
I think
you have answered your own question.
Yeah, but I want you to answer not as a historian, but as a sociologist.
Well, I mean,
how do you see that? What can be the future of the party with this conflict inside it?
Well, okay, that is a good question, and needless to say, I agonize over these questions, so I may not have a very clear answer for you. It actually does have a historical. It can only be answered historically because we can only predict the past. We can't predict the future. And the one thing we do know is this. First of all, history does, this is a very silly answer to start. History is filled with surprises. I will give you the biggest surprise, okay? Lyndon Johnson. Everyone presumed that civil rights would literally die on the in Congress because Lyndon Johnson was a senator from the state of Texas. And he had become literally the master of the Senate when he was a senator. He basically controlled the Senate. And whenever a civil rights bill came up in the Senate, it would make it through, but it would be watered down. This is in the late 1950s. So everyone figured that if on Kennedy's assassination, that Lyndon Johnson would somehow, just literally stifle the civil rights movement, the legislation necessary, okay? But first of all, it showed that people had no idea of Lyndon Johnson's biography. He had been a school teacher in a poor part of Texas, in a Mexican-American community. He became a significant figure in the New Deal in Texas. He actually led the National Youth Administration in Texas. He talked of FDR as his hero. FDR promoted him in many ways. And in fact, his own pursuit of Congress was viewed to a great extent as a liberal, but Texas was a corrupt state. So, the only way he could then advance was to take monies from very rich conservative people. Now, what's interesting is if one looked closely, Lyndon Johnson was never actually a white supremacist. It's that in order to sustain his political career, he would regularly dampen down the civil rights legislation. It turns out that he was far more committed to civil rights than John Kennedy ever was. John Kennedy wasn't even a liberal. And he made it clear to people in his career he was not a liberal. So surprisingly, Lyndon Johnson is the president who, in his own fashion, works with Martin Luther King and the labor movement to pass Civil Rights Act, to pass the Voting Rights Act, to pass Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is healthcare for people on Social Security who are over the age of 65. Medicaid is for people who make the poor, basically, healthcare for the poor. He passed, and Lyndon Johnson signs into law the first Immigration Reform Act, which opens the door, as it had once upon a time been opened for immigration. So he became, and by the way, there were failings, and I could clearly talk about those. I mean, the war in Vietnam is one of them, and others domestically. But he became, after Roosevelt, the most progressive president in the 20th century regarding domestic policy. Okay, now, the problem is that neither Joe Biden or Kamala Harris are Lyndon Johnson. But there's no question that DSA has little reason to hope for much from this administration. The question will be, and I'm in DSA, but I'm rather more, in the 90s, I was active writer for DSA. I'm now just pay my dues, okay? So, but the thing is that my argument still stands that the way forward is for DSA, for all progressive groups, to make it a point of empowering the forces in Congress that are pursuing the progressive agenda, such that they literally get out in front of Biden and Harris. Now, this is another thing that you should keep in mind. Jonathan, I lost you on my screen, but keep this in mind. No, there you are. Okay. We have congressional elections every 2 years. In 1994, Bill Clinton was devastated, congressionally speaking. He lost, the Republicans took complete control of Congress in 1994 because Bill Clinton was such an utter disappointment. Okay, he not only made a total cock-up, you would say, a total mess of the healthcare question, he also signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was a real benefit to the corporate elite. And they lost. In 2010, Barack Obama lost even on an even grander scale because state houses went Republican as well. Why? Because Barack Obama failed to live up to the expectations. There were a lot of columnists and even liberals said, oh, he was asking too much. As I say, bullshit, he was asking too little. Americans were waiting to be mobilized by the president who said, yes, we can. And I've written about this in Take Hold of Our History. So my thinking is that if Biden and Harris do not want to be devastated within 2 years, they are going to have to pursue a progressive agenda. It's a reality, absolute reality. On top of that, it's even shocking to me now that in light of the pandemic, they have not called for universal health care now. Nevertheless, you're going to see them have to do things they probably had not envisioned before. Although I actually do believe that Kamala Harris supports universal health care. I believe she came out in favor of it and then backed off because she figured it was a losing question. I believe she would be eager to endorse universal health care. That's the one thing that I really do believe about her. Other than that, I don't know what to expect. So I think the problem, the divide, the abyss, and DSA itself is not the left in America, but the left in America, they will have to do things that the left wants, because if they don't, American politics will revert. In 2016, Bernie Sanders would have won the presidency if he had won the nomination. Americans said they wanted radical change. When Hillary Clinton got the nomination, it was obvious there was going to be no radical change. And thus they voted out of anger, you might say, for Trump, because they wanted to punch the establishment in the nose. And one thing that Trump did, as I think we mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, is he did attack the establishment. And there was a notion that he might actually do something for American working people. Look, he hasn't, is a disaster, okay? But right-wing populists always lie. It comes with the territory. The question is whether or not Biden and Harris are smart enough. By the way, one other thing I want to mention, this is something that is the case. Franklin Roosevelt ran as a progressive in 1932 for the presidency. But what really enabled him to move really left was not only the press of labor, labor's pressure from below, it's because capital turned on him. Capitalists actually liked Roosevelt to begin with. They thought he was going to, can I talk about this or are we going too long? Okay. Roosevelt, the capitalists in this country, the richest people in America, believed that Roosevelt, for whatever he would do for working people, would do something for them. And what they thought he would do was bring an end to prohibition, which was the ban on the sale of alcohol in the United States, right? Which was part of that 1920s conservatism. They wanted brought to an end, not so they could drink. They had never stopped drinking. They had always had the ability to buy liquor one way or another. They thought if beer could be sold again in the taverns, the tax on every beer would keep Roosevelt from raising taxes on the rich. He did bring an end to prohibition, Roosevelt, but he also raised taxes on the rich significantly. And he also signed into law bills, and he issued executive orders that reduced the power of capital. So they turned on him, and they ran a major campaign. They spent millions to run a campaign called the American Liberty League, claiming he was either a fascist or a communist. They didn't quite get it straight. And as a consequence, but they could never get the grassroots movement. They could never get working people to support that effort. And in 1934, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats won Congress all the more heavily. And in 1936, once again. So I have this little fantasy. This is completely out of the realm of reality. The fantasy is that the capitalists will turn on Biden and Harris in some way and drive Biden and Harris into the arms of the left. You all think
Professor.
I'm delusional, but you know, what am I going to say?
I sometimes I think I'm too pessimistic. That's the point. But okay.
I'm not optimistic. I just don't see any choice but to go in a given direction. Because if I don't, then I will always regret not doing so.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, I invite Jonas now for the next question.
Hi, thank you so much, Harvey. Thanks so much for the invitation, Daniel. And thank you, Mateus, the president of National History Association here in Federal District. I don't know how to say Brasilia, in Federal District here, to support this event, to fight to happen. So, Mateus, thank you very much. Mateus, our president, he filed a lawsuit to Supreme Court to lose his election, but we don't let him. So, Mateus, stay here with us for many years. Harvey, I'm learning so much here today, and I have two subjects. I will stop in the first one, and then we talk or not, depending. The first subject is about Kennedy Maxwell. He wrote a column here in Brazil, in Folha de São Paulo, and he wrote about the changes in university. These changes he wrote about is this change in the 60s, 70s. How can I say that? The changes in university, he talked about Harvard, I think. In the 60s is about the Black is beautiful, and now in the early 31st century is about multiculturalism is beautiful. What I want to say here is the changes in the university. Can you talk about this? How changed the society in the US in these many years, and what happened now? What broke in these progressive changes or progressive hopeful we have to America, and Trump happened?
Yeah, well, first thing to remember is, of course, there are so many different dimensions of American universities.
Yes.
So there's the private sector of American universities, which includes the elite universities like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. And then there's the public universities. And my career, from my student days all the way through to my PhD, is public universities. And I think that the changes that have taken place in public universities is a far more important set of developments than those in private universities. And I do know something about them, mostly because my daughter went to Harvard and Harvard Law School. And as a consequence, I became all the more sort of associated and knowledgeable with what goes on there. But this is the thing. So public universities were first created because of Abraham Lincoln signing something called the Morrill Act, the Land Grant Act. They were created so that the federal government gave lands to the states to set up colleges and universities so that the children of working class and farm families could go to university and be trained in useful arts and ideas. So to improve agriculture, to improve industrial activity, I mean, all the and science, it was a practical matter. And all of those beginnings have now turned into major state university systems. So Rutgers University in New Jersey, where I was an undergraduate, is the land grant University of New Jersey. I went to the University of London, which has nothing to do with this story, but it too is a public university at least. I came back to the United States and I went to Louisiana State University, which is also the land grant university. Now, the idea was that these universities would be very low tuition and possibly free tuition. That is, no charge for higher education or a very low charge. I mean, I think I paid for my tuition back in the late 60s and beginning of the 70s, maybe $500, which today might be the equivalent of no more, maybe $5,000, $7,000, okay? Now, in the course of my career here in Wisconsin, I came to Wisconsin in 1978 as an assistant professor. And so I taught here for more than 40 years. And I always wanted to teach at what I call small d democratic university. I wanted to teach students who came from working class and farming and maybe middle class. I didn't want to teach the children of elite. I always used to say, I don't want my students to think they can buy and sell me, okay? Well, one of the things that's happened, and when I came to Wisconsin, none of my students were borrowing money to go to university. They worked hard. They worked not only summer jobs. By the way, for my Brazilian friends, I'm wearing a turtleneck sweater because, as you can imagine, we're entering winter in Wisconsin. So I actually wondered if I should put on a short sleeve shirt so I wouldn't shock all of you, but I didn't, okay? But my students didn't have to borrow money to go to school because they also worked while they were studying, which also meant I couldn't give them the long list of books to read that I would have liked, but that's a university professor's dream to do. Yeah. Over the course of those 40 years, something happened. So when I came to Wisconsin, the state had a tradition. It was called the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rule. 1/3 tuition students would pay. And by the way, 1/3 citizens of Wisconsin would pay. And 1/3 would be by way of grants and gifts to the university. So tuition was surprising. I used to say, wow, it's really cheap, low price to be a student at the University of Wisconsin system on these campuses. Little by little, in the course of those 40 years, as the Republican conservatives and neoliberals pursued their ambitions of lowering taxes, deregulating business, as they pursued those political ambitions, something had to give. Who's going to pay for public services and social services? And keep this in mind, in the 1970s, we'll go all the way back to what I refer to as the class war. When they smashed the unions, they also smashed the capacity of working people to demand higher wages and better benefits. So what happened? Well, the American working class has not seen a rise in its real wages since the early 1970s. The wealth created by American workers is accumulated in this second Gilded Age oligarchy, this unbelievable class of billionaires. So if you're working class or a middle class working person, and all of a sudden your wages are freezing, and I don't know how much you guys know about 1970s economics, but there was something called stagflation, a stagnant economy and high inflation. So if your wages are not rising, but the cost of living is rising, and no company will ever gather its workers together and say, okay, do you want a raise? Well, of course, all the workers are going to say, give us a raise. There's nothing democratic about capitalism, okay, on the job. So what can they do? They have only one choice. They will vote for politicians who promise to lower taxes. Now, yeah, the rich will make out like bandits when you lower taxes, right? I mean, the millionaires will become billionaires. Working people, they don't care if the rich will get richer. All they know is they need to protect the money that they have if they're going to provide for their families and maybe put money aside in order to allow their kids to go to university. So now the kids of the farm families and working class, and for the 40 years I've been a professor, the majority of my students have been first-generation students at university. They do not come from university-educated families. And I can tell you that nowadays, there is no longer a one-third, one-third, one-third. There's no longer that rule. My students are paying probably $15,000, not $7,000. In other words, it's changed. My students have good reason to believe they're paying far too much because of what they knew of what little they might have known of the past. And by the way, university salaries haven't gone up either very much. So what happened to universities? Well, there was a squeeze on the universities. Along with that squeeze financially were business demands that the universities serve the need. They never said serves the needs of business. I said universities should serve the economy. Universities should serve the needs of industry. That's the term they would use. So we saw the growth of when I came to my university, there was a business department. There's now a school of business. The salaries in the School of Business are dramatically higher than the salaries of professors in the humanities and social sciences. I'll tell you a little joke, and I'll confess to you all something. When I finished my master's, I couldn't get an honest job. So I actually worked for Lloyd's Bank International, which of course is rooted in the Bank of London in South America. So I spent not quite a year as an international lending officer. I learned about international banking. I didn't want to, but literally the only job I could get, because I spoke Spanish, they thought it'd be great. So I left to do my PhD, and because my politics just clearly didn't combine. So what's striking to me is I used to say, well, wait a minute, I know more about business than the folks you're hiring. These business academics, they don't know anything about business, really. I want their salaries. Of course, that's what I would say in the university senate, but nobody would listen. So, but the squeeze was taking place. So, for example, on my retirement, I didn't want to retire because, and not just for myself, but I wanted to protect my department. My seniority at the university could protect the program. I don't even think my department will get to replace me because of the way the budgets are operating. So maybe that's not what you had in mind as an answer, but I think it's really that, but that's the story that's happened.
Yeah, thanks. I have another question about democracy and multi-party system in the US. The view we have of the US show two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, as we know. But it's not true. Have a lot of parties in US, correct?
Not really.
Not really. Why?
Well, okay. There are two parties that are effective in the elections.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, indeed, there are splinter parties, but to be honest, they are inconsequential.
Why that? Why inconsequential?
Well, for a start, American democracy.
Yes, this is the question. Democracy is two parties.
Right. Literally has become, I mean, if you look at American history, there are moments where one of the major parties splits, breaks up. which opens a door for a brief multi-party moment. But even in those moments, another singular party emerges. That's, for example, what happened with the emergence of the Republican Party. And of course, the other thing about it is that the parties change. So, for example, the Democratic Party, which dates itself back to Thomas Jefferson, is also the party that was the party of the South and also the party of the Northern working class, which was a very, very uneasy alliance. And in the course of the 1960s, of course, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, as Lyndon Johnson figured, once he signed those bills into law, that what was going to happen is that they were going to lose the South, the Democratic Party. And they didn't lose the South as quickly as they expected. But between the years of 1965 and 1970, the shift was occurring, and the Republicans became the party, literally, of what we used to call Dixie. If you know what I'm saying, okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So these parties change. That was the party of Lincoln, is now the party of white supremacy, right? The Democratic Party. But the small parties in some states, for example, they will have third parties. One thing you have to understand is election rules vary from state to state. So in New York State, you can have what they call fusion. So in New York State, for some time, there was a Labor Party, a Liberal Party, then there emerged a Working Families Party. But these parties can run candidates for state and local office and endorse the Democratic Party candidate, okay? Which means then that, in essence, they can ride to some extent on that, but also offer a maybe more progressive alternative. And there was a lawsuit by the Working Families Party. I'm losing track of time, and maybe it was 15 years ago, whatever. They were trying to extend that arrangement into other states, like Wisconsin. And it was said, unless the state changed the election laws, the courts would not overturn that law. So I can tell you this, there are a lot of people on the left who would love to see the Democratic Party explode to allow for that possibility. If the Democrats do not do what the progressives urge upon them, not that they would go all the way to universal health care, not that they would take on the Green New Deal as AOC herself outlined, but if they don't move in those directions, then I could imagine, Anna said, she didn't expect me to predict, and I don't mean to be a prophet at all, but I could imagine a major split inside of the Democratic Party. I can also imagine, and I can tell you what people are talking about, the effort by the Republicans who left the Republican Party. They have made significant inroads into the Democratic establishment, and there are many on the left who fear the possibility that those kinds of Republicans might try to take over the Democratic Party, or the Republican Party could split. I mean, so I don't see small parties right now, but we are at a moment where the parties could fragment to some extent. And so I won't tell you what I expect to happen, but I can tell you what I could imagine happening. There you go. Does that help at all?
Yes, help. Thank you so much.
There's an effort, last note, there is an effort right now to form a People's Party on the left. I don't know. I mean, what I say is, I don't know what will happen because it all hangs on what happens in the next 2 years.
Thank you.
Okay, so for the last question, no pressure.
Jose.
Mateus.
Mateus.
Our president.
Where's that? It's just all of a sudden it's in the middle of my screen, Jose. But
I know that we are talking about Biden, but he is the Mr. President here.
Okay, where is Mateus?
Can you see me?
Yeah, you're right. Blue
Yes.
shirt? Is it blue?
Yes, blue shirt.
Okay,
yes,
got it.
That's
Okay.
me.
Right.
Professor Harvey, thank you very much for the interview. So my question is, I'm a professor of the history of the present time.
Ah, contemporary historian.
Is history. So my question is, if in Brazil, Bolsonaro, sorry for the bad word,
how many letters? B-O-L-S-O. It's more than 4. Yes.
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's too much.
Right.
Did not accept the result of the election because he lose and change the security secretary right after the election. I personally would be terrified. I would be afraid. So at the moment,
Daniel will tell you, I was afraid for you.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Right. I was reaching out. I wanted to make sure he was safe. So.
Yes. So at the moment in the USA, is there any fear of a coup because of Trump doesn't accept the results of the election?
It's a great question. I can tell you that. No, in fact, I think a lot of us were looking to see what he would try to do. Okay. I don't think we expected the military to be involved at all. Not that kind of classic, golpe de Estado. We didn't expect that kind of a coup. I'm not even sure we expected any state agency and its security forces. I didn't expect that. I was actually worried about something else. And here's what I expected him to pull, and there's still talk of it, a constitutional coup. Okay, that is, yes, somebody just highlighted the state legislatures. That is, because of our electoral college system, it is not out of the realm of possibility that the Republican state legislatures in Wisconsin, Michigan, and I'm not sure of the full composition of Michigan and Pennsylvania, but of these states, that they might try to name the electors themselves, disregarding the popular vote. And as a consequence, when the Electoral College would meet, would grant Donald Trump the presidency. However, Trump's numbers, though incredibly high for the losing candidate, are actually swamped right now by the popular vote for Joe Biden. It's record breaking, and it's far higher than, and it's actually more in line with what the polls said would happen, even if the Electoral College doesn't quite line up that way. It's also the case that a number of, to my mind, really serious constitutional lawyers have shown the degree to which it likely could not be accomplished. Okay. And then there's this message that came the other day, which people are putting some confidence in fear that it might end up in the Supreme Court, which is now dominated by the right wing, 6-3. What's in front of them right now is the question of the constitutionality, once again, of the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. And Roberts, who's the Chief Justice of the court, last time cast the deciding vote recognizing the constitutionality. Apparently, Brett Kavanaugh has said something to the effect that he's lining up with Roberts, which will line up with the liberals on the court. Now, what that's telling is that it may well be that, as abysmal as these conservative justices are, that they are not going to try to override the will of the people. Okay. And even though that happened to some extent in 2000, this is not 2000. The popular vote this time is very high, and it's not a question of just one state. So it's very unlikely. So I'm not as worried as I was last week about that question, okay? I just am not as worried. But then again, maybe everybody else is.
Thank you, Professor.
I could tell you what else would be a coup, however, in a political sense. You know, I just mentioned the Republicans' efforts to take over the Democratic Party. Yeah. That's not crazy, because Joe Biden throughout the last year has said that he can reach a hand across the aisle and work with Republicans. And he's made it a point of bringing people in. I expect at least one cabinet post to go to a Republican. The question is, which cabinet posts go to Republicans? So,
thank you very much.
Thank
Professor.
you for asking that.
Professor Harvey, thank you very much for this interview. It was a great pleasure for all of us to have this opportunity to talk to you, learn a lot from you. I think it was a pretty pleasant experience. Thank you very much.
Can I just say something in farewell?
You can say some things if you want, Professor.
Okay. Well, I want to say, look, some of us are professors and some of us are graduate students. Those of us who are professors, I'm sure will agree with what I'm about to say, and it's advice to graduate students. We don't know anything until we have to teach it. So I figured that what you did for me is you challenged me to explain to you what I know, but I might not have always had to say to people from Brazil. So I've learned something in the process. I say for graduate students because the anxiety will not end when your dissertations and theses are approved.
Yes.
The anxiety begins when you first have to start teaching. There's nothing harder to do than go from being a graduate student to being a professor. But if you get that dissertation done, you're on your way. Thank you very, very much. I seriously feel honored by this, and I hope we didn't take up too much time of the conference.
Not at all, Professor. Not at all.
Thank you.
Eu agradeço vocês que nos assistiram até agora, que acompanharam toda a AMPU Distrito Federal e, particularmente, essa conferência de encerramento. Até a próxima, então. Muito obrigado.